Hey guys, this is retyopko of the Worldwide Duelists, and welcome to a very exciting decklist video. This is the decklist, the Infernoid decklist, that just recently won YCS Dallas. It was only released about 45 minutes ago, and this is an important decklist because this Infernoid decklist went completely undefeated. The player piloting it was obviously very skilled, but this deck went completely undefeated in matches, did not lose a single match during the entire tournament, and ended up taking first place. So this was YCS Dallas, took place over October 3rd and 4th, and as I said, this decklist was just very recently released, so I figured it would be a very good idea to do a decklist video about it, so that you guys can see what Infernoids are looking like in the TCG. So let's go ahead and jump right into things. First off, we're going to start with the 1-of Card Trooper, a card that has been limited to for quite a while now. I believe it was limited to 1 at one point, but is now sitting at 2. This is to prevent machine duplication for being a very, very strong card, but this player is only playing 1 regardless, which is pretty interesting. I've seen people flip-flop between 1 and 2 from the deck list that I've seen. I have a few friends that play a lot of Infernoids, and I've seen their deck lists as well. As a matter of fact, later on we're going to be having a more in-depth deck list from someone who has played the deck a lot, as opposed to the topping deck list from this YCS. So 1 Card Trooper, this is a card that will stop your reasoning. Most people will call 1 with reasoning now that Decatron is a card that is released in the TCG. But having a level 3 as well as 3 level 4s to stop your reasoning means that you might, get a special summon off of your reasoning instead of just ending up sending Decatron to the grave. 3 Entra. Entra is the card that once per turn you can target 1 face-up card your opponent controls, return it to the hand. I imagine this is pretty good against matchups such as Shaddolls, as well as in a somewhat out to things like Imperial Iron Wall, if you send this with Decatron. Otherwise, it's pretty interesting. I've seen from the deck list that I've seen this card only being run at 2, but Entra at 3 is pretty interesting. Atondel at 3. Atondel is probably one of the better big Infernoids because you only have to banish 2 for a 2800 beat stick, whereas the only ones bigger than that are Deviati and Anunku, both of which require you to banish 3 Infernoids instead. And its effect is actually a pretty strong. Being able to attack twice is a pretty strong effect, especially when you're talking 2800 attack. Then we have 3 Decatron. Decatron at 3 is pretty obvious choice. Decatron is probably the best main deck monster that the deck has, simply because it allows you to send whatever Infernoid you need. It's an instant out to basically any floodgate if you send Petrulia with it, which is once per turn you can target 1 spell trap card on the field and destroy it. So things like Imperial Iron Wall, cards such as Vanity's Emptiness, all these cards that would prevent Infernoids from actually doing things, you can normal summon your Decatron, send a Petrulia, get out to it, send a Harmadic, and you'll be able to pop up whatever monster on the field. Those are going to be your the 2 cards that you send most often, but you might also want to send an Entra, or you might want to send a Paramus, which is target a set card, shuffle it into the deck. So Decatron is basically, every Infernoid monster in the deck. In a way, it's kind of like a Shadow Squamata, where it can be any other Infernoid from the deck. Then we have Deviati, which is my personal favorite, and one of the reasons why I play Infernoids from time to time using my friend's deck list. This has to be my personal favorite Infernoid monster, because it's Heavy Storm on legs. When this card is special summoned, you can pop every spell and trap card on the field, except for Void cards, meaning that your Void Seer, or if you're playing cards such as Void Vanishment or Void Dream, I believe, they will be protected from this effect. So I really like Deviati because it's a heavy storm for the entire field. It's beautiful, it's great. And also, when monster effects are activated, you can tribute a monster, negate the activation, and destroy it. Also meaning that, or banish it rather, you don't even destroy it. Meaning that you can even tribute the Deviati itself to prevent the monster effect from going off. As well as 2900 attack, 2900 defense. Deviati is just really, really, really incredibly strong. Then we have Harmadic. This was a $25 to $30 card earlier on before the reprint. It's slowly going back up in price now that Infernoids have topped this YCS, but Infernoid Harmadic, level 3, which is really relevant when you consider that, say you reasoning off into a Raiden or a Lila, one of your level 4 normal summons, and then you also have a Decatron on the field. what you can do is you can send the Harmodic, pop a monster, and then you can go into a rank 4. Unfortunately, the Volleyball Chain isn't something you can go into anymore, but one of the best cards that you can go into would be the Lightsworn Minerva, but obviously being a YCS prize card, not everyone has access to it. However, that being said, it would be a really strong rank 4 for people to be able to go into. But this is basically your access to rank 4s right here with your Decatron and your level 4 normal summons. Next up we have a Nunku. Actually, one thing I do want to mention before I move on to a Nunku, these two ratios, actually, a Nunku and Harmodic. Again, from the decklist that I've seen people running Harmodic at 3 because it's really strong. Being able to pop a monster and also being only a level 3 is pretty strong in Infernoids. It doesn't up your level count by that much, and being able to target any monster on the field and destroy it is pretty good. All the little Infernoids also have the ability to tribute you tribute a monster, target a card in your opponent's graveyard, and you can banish it. This is really strong against like BA, Necroz. It's a really strong effect having a DD Crow that has legs. However, only running the 2 Harmodic and running 1 Anunku, Decklist I've seen ran 2 Anunku and then 3 Harmodic. So it's interesting that these are the ratios that this guy happened to end up with that apparently worked. 3 Petrulia. Petrulia is also really good. Target spell trap card on the field and destroy it. It's basically Harmodic except for spells and traps. It's not as good to send with Decatron because you're not going to be able to make a rank 4 afterwards, but being able to pop any spell and trap card on the field is insanely good. As I said before, it allows Decatron to be an out to Vanities and Iron Wall, which is just incredibly strong. We have 1 copy of Infernoid Permace. Permace isn't particularly strong. It's a level 1, and it doesn't have any stats to speak of. Being able to target a set card on the field and shuffle it into the deck can actually be it's pretty situational, but I can imagine situations where it would be really valuable, such as if you know your opponent has a set Shadow monster, or if they have basically anything that would be set on the field. It can be a pretty decent out to it. Not being able to activate the effect, the card, rather. Not being able to activate the card in response to this effect's activation is also really strong because you can use it on an Iron Wall. If your opponent doesn't think to use it, preventatively, you can stop them from activating things, before they can activate them, obviously. 3 Saitsumas. Saitsumas is also pretty strong. 3 of him and 3 of Atondel makes sense because you only have to banish 2 for a relatively strong monster. It also has a very strong effect, being able to banish any card on the field if it destroyed if it attacked an opponent monster. It doesn't even need to have destroyed it. So, Saitsumas is also really strong. Being able to only have to banish 2 Infernoids for those monsters is probably their biggest selling point, because you get a really strong monster, really good stats, really good effect, and you only have to banish 2 as opposed to 3 for Deviati and Anunku. And then, as I said before, the 3 Lightsworn monsters to go with your Charge of the Light Brigade. Charge of the Light Brigade being at 2 here in the TCG, although I believe the OCG recently got it at 2 as well. Makes the running the Lightsworns in Infernoids very, very valuable, as opposed to running, say, more copies of Card Trooper or anything else of that sort. Lila is also now 2 Iron Wall and Vanities, which is a really good thing. This is a card that you probably end up keeping in against a lot of decks, whereas you might even side your Raidens and your Chargers out. Lila being able to be an out to things is just a really big deal, because Infernoids get shut down by these floodgates a lot harder than a lot of other decks do. And you want to have, outs to them that aren't Galaxy Cyclone, because Galaxy Cyclone does not out Iron Wall. It can be an out to Vanities, but isn't always necessarily one when you need it. And then 2 Raiden. Raiden being able to mill 4 cards on your opening turn is really, really strong. Being able to mill right away, as opposed to having to wait till the end phase with Lila or even Lumina, is really, really good. So it makes sense to run 2 of these. You don't want to run too many normal summons, obviously, because you have your Lightsworns and your Card Trooper, and then you also technically have your Decatrons. These are the cards that will stop your Reasonings. None of the other Infernoids are going to stop Reasonings because they cannot be normal summoned, as it says in the very first sentence of all of them. But you don't want to run too many cards to stop your Reasoning, because otherwise you won't get very strong Reasonings. You won't mill the cards that you really do want to mill. 1 Burial from the Different Dimension, very obvious. It's going to be able to recharge your graveyard late game or mid game. basically allowing you to summon more Infernoid monsters, which is really, really strong. Burial is basically equal to another Anunku or Deviati summon, which can be game-changing, because Anunku pops all the monsters on the field besides itself. And it has the ability to tribute itself and prevent the You tribute a monster, negate the activation of a spell, trap card, or effect. So this prevents spells and traps. Deviati stops monster effects, and then they pop. This one pops monsters. This one pops spells and traps on the field. So it's basically a free one of those, which is pretty good. Charge of the Light Brigade to search your light sworns out. This is just more basically on-demand milling. Although I can imagine it's pretty unfortunate to mill all 3 of your light sworns and then still have this card in the deck. Obviously not always going to happen, but I can imagine it's pretty unfortunate. 2 Galaxy Cyclone. Galaxy Cyclone is a really strong card because unlike MST, it's going to have utility in the grave, although I can imagine against decks that would side in Iron Wall, which is basically anything nowadays, since Cosmo and this deck are both decks that are pretty relevant. I can imagine siding MST in Game 2 and 3 might be a better idea, but Game 1, Galaxy Cyclone is very strong. Not many people would be maining Iron Wall, and Galaxy Cyclone is basically double use if you draw it, or you can mill it and you'll still have a use out of it. Monster Gate, which is basically a 4th copy of Reasoning. You need a monster on the field to tribute, but what you can do, you can use your Reasoning, whatever you summon off of this, and then use Monster Gate and just mill more cards. Basically, Reasoning and Monster Gate are the engine of this deck. They make it run really fast. Obviously, having Charge of the Light Brigade and the Light Sworns, as well as Card Trooper, you can mill a little bit, but Reasoning is going to be your big, mill all your deck and then be able to play the entire game. 1-for-1 to summon the Decatron from the deck. Basically, you can discard whatever Infernoid you don't need. Probably one of the big ones that can be summoned from the graveyard. And then be able to go into Decatron, mill whatever you need. It's basically a 4th Decatron. 1 copy of Raigeki. Raigeki's pretty stable in this format, so it makes sense. 3 copies of Reasoning. You have to run this in Infernoids. You really can't get away with running less. In fact, if Monster Gate was at anything but 1, I think people would probably run, 3 Monster Gate, 3 Reasoning. Pretty much, you would definitely want to run that. 1 copy of Rekindling, which is really interesting. This is an interesting tech. The only thing that you can summon in the deck off of it is Decatron, but if you do summon, multiple Decatron off of it, you're getting huge value. Giving, all the Infernoids are fire monsters. People might have thought that they were dark type, or dark attribute monsters. No, they are indeed fire attribute. So you can summon them off of Rekindling, and summoning 3 Decatron off of Rekindling, I imagine, is just, super valuable. You'll get all the field pops you possibly need, and then be able to summon your big guys and attack. 2 copies of Voidseer. Voidseer is a really strong card. It's basically make any Infernoid you control unaffected by card effects this turn, by your opponent's card effects, and then you can banish it from the graveyard instead of destroying one of those monsters. Interesting thing about the banishing effect from the graveyard, this is something that does not actually go on the chain, if I remember correctly. It basically just kind of activates. It just happens. It's almost like an inherent summon. It just kind of happens, and it's a pretty good card as well. And then 1 copy of Torrential Tribute. Interesting as this one guy's 1 main decked trap, as opposed to something like Warning, or what else you might want to run. So the 1 copy of Torrential Tribute is just an interesting tech. You could run basically any other one of, maybe even the 2nd Card Trooper instead of this, but it's just interesting that that's what this guy decided to run. Alright, let's take a look at the side deck, because this is pretty interesting. Chaos Hunter is a really good tech in this deck, actually. It's really, really good for the mirror match, as well as against Cosmos and Nekroz. As you can see, your opponent cannot banish cards, and you can summon this whenever they would special summon a monster by discarding 1 card. As I said before, this deck doesn't really care about discarding their cards, which is why 1-for-1 is a really good card, and why this would end up being a really good card. Having a 2500 body is also really relevant, and being able to stop your opponent from banishing cards without having to run Iron Wall, which you risk milling, is really, really strong. 2 copies of Defusion. I imagine this is just for getting over Construct and Winda. Dark Claw as well. So it makes sense to run Defusion because all 3 of those cards are pretty, they're pretty hindering to you. 3 copies of MST, as I said before. Galaxy Cyclone cannot stop Iron Wall. This card isn't out to Iron Wall. 1 copy of Breakthrough Skill, which is really interesting. I guess he just had like an extra space to fill and didn't know what to put here, so 1 copy of Breakthrough Skill. I imagine that's probably sided in during the Shadow matchup as well as against Dark Claw, because those cards are really preventative. 2 copies of Fairy Wind, really good against Iron Wall as well. However, you can also side them in against Cleaforts to stop their scales, side it in against the Tellers, stop their Call of the Haunteds and Oasises and what have you, all their back row. This is a really interesting tech that I don't believe I've ever seen in a topping deck list. This is Mischief of the Gnomes. This turn, reduce the levels of all monsters in each player's hand by 1. You can banish this card from the graveyard. This turn, reduce the levels of all monsters in each player's hand by 1. So effectively, you can activate this, reduce the levels of the monsters in your hand by 2, and then you can put more monsters onto the field. This is just a really, really interesting tech. It's not a bad card. You can use it, I believe, to prevent like Necros from doing things. You can do it to prevent BA. You can do it to prevent Satellers from going into rank 4s. It's a really, really, really interesting card. And in Infernoids, it allows you to do things like reduce your Harmodic to level 1, and then you can put, more Infernoids on the field as opposed to being stopped early. 2 copies of Mistake, which is really strong. This deck basically does no searching outside of Charge of the Light Brigade, so Mistake ends up being really strong. The only thing about running back row in Infernoids is that you have the chance of milling everything, so you really want to run things like Breakthrough Skill and Galaxy Cyclone that do give you use in the graveyard. But Mistake is such a strong card this format, it makes sense to run it at 2. And then 2 copies of Royal Decree. This deck, again, dies to Iron Wall, dies to Vanity pretty hard, so this is just another out to those cards. The extra deck, finally. Decatron is, in fact, a tuner monster, which allows you to run things like a bunch of synchros. So this card, which a lot of people have brought up, PSY-Framelord Omega. This card is really, really interesting, and you've actually, if you look on the Konami blog, this card was brought up in a great number of this guy's feature matches. This card is really interesting. Once per turn during either player's main phase, you can banish this card and 1 random card from your opponent's hand. That's pretty strong. And then once per turn during your opponent's standby phase, you can target 1 banished card, return it to the graveyard. So this is a 2800 body that can be made really easily. It's a level 8, so if you send your Decatron and then send a Harmodic with it, you can tune, your Lila or whatever other level 4, a Patrulia, or you can send, a Patrulia and then tune a Harmodic, or there's a ton of different ways that you can make level 8s with this deck because Decatron is in fact a tuner, and this card is going to recharge your graveyard every single one of your opponent's standby phases, while also being a 2800 body, which is really big. If this card is in your graveyard, you can target 1 other card in either player's graveyard, shuffle both that card and this card from the graveyard into the deck. So it also has basically infinite uses, because you can recycle it back into your extra deck. The other synchros aren't as particularly interesting. The only ones that I think I would really want to make like a huge deal out of would be Gaia Knight, the Force of Earth, and Scrap Archfiend, as well as Gem Knight Pearl in the XYZs. The reason that you run these cards is because the Infernoids only count the levels of the field of effect monsters, whereas this card, and this card are non-effect monsters, meaning they don't count towards the level/rank count, so that's pretty strong. Other synchros, these are just generic good stuff synchros. Black Rose, Clearwing is really good, Goyo's strong, Leo is really strong against things like BA, although this deck has a really easy BA matchup as it is. And then Star Eater, Stardust Spark, all really strong cards. Having Stardust Spark on Mistake on the field must be, really, really strong. And then for rank 4s, we have Abyss Dweller, Castel, Exciton, and Gem Knight Pearl. These are just generic good stuff, rank 4s. Interestingly enough, there's a Divine Dragon Knight Felgrand, which I believe these guys only count level 8 or lower, so you can have 2 level 8s on the field and not have it be a problem, as well as Big Eye, which you can make with 2 level 7s, which, again, these cards are really easy to make with a card like Decatron because its levels will get increased by the monster that you send. So guys, I believe that's going to cover it for this Infernoid YCS winning deck list. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you learned a little bit about Infernoids. Please remember that if you did enjoy this video, go ahead and leave a comment, and consider subscribing to the Worldwide Duelists. Remember, you guys keep the world turning.